I used to believe the safest room in any house was the kitchen. Maybe it was because every kitchen smelled like ordinary life, fresh coffee, warm bread, and tomorrow's dinner. Ordinary things never frightened me. People did. That night, the kitchen inside Adrian Romano's estate should have felt impossible to cry in. Every polished marble counter reflected soft golden light. Copper pans hung above the island like artwork. A pot of tomato sauce simmered quietly on the stove, filling the room with basil and garlic that reminded me of Sundays I barely remembered from childhood. Outside, rain tapped against the enormous windows, gentle enough to sound comforting instead of lonely. I stood beside the sink with a dish towel twisted between my fingers until the fabric dug into my palms. I'd promised myself I wouldn't cry. Not here. Not anywhere anyone could see. I'd spent years becoming an expert at swallowing tears before they reached my eyes. Smile. Say you're tired. Change the subject. Leave the room. Those tricks had kept people from asking questions they never really wanted answered. But exhaustion has a strange way of pulling the truth out of you. My shoulders started shaking before I realized I was crying. I covered my mouth to silence every sound, terrified someone might hear me, even though this house was large enough to swallow footsteps whole. I counted my breaths the way my therapist once taught me. 1, 2, 3. It wasn't working. My heartbeat echoed louder than the rain. Somewhere upstairs, a grandfather clock chimed midnight. The sound reminded me how long I'd spent pretending everything was fine. I reached for a paper towel, wiped my cheeks, and whispered to my reflection in the dark window, "You're okay." The woman staring back didn't believe me. Neither did I. The door behind me opened so quietly I never heard it. I only noticed because another reflection appeared beside mine. Tall, motionless, dark suit without a wrinkle despite the late hour. Adrian Romano never seemed rushed, never seemed surprised, never seemed to miss anything. People across the city feared him for reasons they rarely spoke aloud. Yet in that moment, he didn't look dangerous. He looked concerned. His green eyes moved from the untouched cup of tea beside me to the trembling hand still gripping the towel. He didn't ask why I was crying. He didn't pretend not to notice. He simply walked to the doorway, closed it with deliberate care, and turned the lock with a soft click that echoed through the silent kitchen. My pulse jumped. Every instinct screamed for me to retreat. Adrian lifted both hands slightly, keeping his distance, his voice calm enough to settle the storm outside. "Grace," he said quietly, "look at me." I couldn't. "No one is coming through that door," he continued. "Not until you tell me who taught you to be afraid of kindness." My eyes stayed fixed on the rain streaking across the window, because looking at Adrian felt far more dangerous than looking at my own reflection. Kindness had always come with conditions. It arrived wrapped in promises that slowly became expectations, then obligations, until one morning I realized I no longer recognized myself. My fingers tightened around the dish towel again. "Nobody," I whispered. The answer sounded weak even to me. Adrian did not challenge it. He simply crossed the room toward the stove, lowered the flame beneath the simmering sauce, and poured the untouched tea into the sink before filling the kettle with fresh water. The ordinary sounds filled the silence between us. Running water, metal against porcelain, the soft click of the burner. Somehow they steadied my breathing more than comforting words ever could. "Cold tea never helps," he said quietly. "Neither does pretending." I almost laughed, but it came out as another shaky breath instead. He placed a clean mug on the counter without sliding it toward me, giving me the choice to reach for it myself. That tiny gesture caught me off guard. Most people rushed to fix tears because they were uncomfortable seeing them. Adrian seemed willing to let the silence exist until I decided what to do with it. "You watch everyone," I finally said. "You noticed?" His expression barely changed. "I notice when someone stops sleeping." My heart skipped. "I notice when someone flinches because a cabinet door closes too loudly." He glanced toward my hands. "I notice when someone apologizes every time they walk into a room, even when they have done nothing wrong." I swallowed hard because every word was true. I had never realized how visible those habits were until someone described them out loud. "You smile differently now than you did 3 months ago," he continued. "Back then it reached your eyes. Now it ends before it gets there." The kettle began to whistle softly. He turned away just long enough to pour hot water into the mug before placing it within reach. "Chamomile. Honey. No questions. No pressure. Just warmth rising between us." I wrapped both hands around the cup, grateful for something to hold. You do not have to tell me everything tonight, Adrian said. But do not insult yourself by saying nothing happened. My vision blurred again. Not because I wanted to cry, but because someone had finally spoken to the version of me I had worked so hard to hide. I stared into the steam curling above the tea, watching it disappear into the light. I keep thinking if I stay quiet long enough, I admitted, my voice barely audible, my past will forget where to find me. Adrian looked at me with a calm certainty that settled deeper than any reassurance I had ever heard. The past does not forget, he said. It follows, which is exactly why you should never face it alone. I did not answer right away. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, even though nothing around us had changed. Rain still traced slow lines across the windows. The kettle had gone silent. Somewhere beyond the walls of the estate, the city kept moving as if this night were no different from any other. But inside that room, time seemed to wait for me. I wrapped my hands tighter around the warm mug, letting the heat settle into fingers that always felt cold after sunset. I thought leaving would be enough, I said at last. My own voice sounded unfamiliar, softer than I remembered. I changed my apartment. I changed my phone number. I even changed where I bought groceries because I was afraid someone might recognize me. I looked down at the tea instead of at Adrian. For a while I convinced myself it worked. Silence answered me. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that allowed painful memories to surface without rushing them away. Then little things started happening. I continued. A bouquet with no card outside my door. Someone parking across the street for hours. Calls from numbers that disappeared before I could answer. Maybe they meant nothing. Maybe I imagined half of it. But once you spend enough time being afraid, your mind stops knowing the difference. My chest tightened as another memory surfaced. Now every unexpected sound makes me think someone found me again. Adrian rested one hand against the edge of the marble counter. His expression remained steady, but his eyes sharpened in a way I had not seen before. Did you tell the police? He asked gently. I nodded once. There was not enough evidence. They told me to document everything and stay alert. I laughed quietly, although there was no humor in it. Do you know how exhausting it is to stay alert every hour of every day? Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the large security monitor mounted near the pantry entrance. Several camera views quietly displayed every hallway, entrance, and garden surrounding the estate. He studied them for a moment before turning back to me. This house has many rules, he said. Most people believe they exist to protect me. He shook his head slightly. They exist to protect everyone inside these walls. His words settled over me more heavily than I expected. I had accepted his job offer weeks earlier because I needed stability, never imagining that safety might come with it. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small access card on the counter between us. Starting tonight, every entrance recognizes this card. You can enter any safe area of the estate at any hour. If you cannot sleep, come to the kitchen. Read in the library. Walk through the garden. No one will question you. I stared at the card without touching it. Why are you doing this for me? His answer came without hesitation, quiet enough that I almost missed it. Because fear has already taken enough from your life. It does not get to take your tomorrow as well. The access card remained untouched between us for several seconds before I finally reached for it. It felt surprisingly light in my hand, a simple piece of black plastic carrying more peace than I had known in years. I slipped it into my pocket as though I was afraid it might disappear if I looked away. The rain outside had softened into a quiet drizzle, leaving tiny silver trails across the glass. For the first time that evening, I realized my breathing had slowed. Adrian watched me with the patience of someone who understood that trust could never be demanded. It had to arrive one careful step at a time. You still think this is your fault, he said. It was not a question. I lowered my eyes. Sometimes I wonder if I stayed too long. Sometimes I wonder if I should have seen the warning signs sooner. Maybe if I had made different choices. My words faded before they reached the end of the sentence. Shame had a way of finishing thoughts for me. Adrian rested both hands on the marble counter. Grace, listen to me. His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet certainty. Being treated without respect is never something you earn. Fear convinces good people that they caused their own suffering. It lies. I closed my eyes because hearing someone else say those words hurt more than believing the opposite. Tears gathered again, but this time I did not hide them. He never had to raise his voice near the end, I admitted. A single text message could ruin an entire day. One unexpected phone call could make me change my plans. I started asking permission for things nobody should ever need permission to do. I stopped wearing my favorite colors because he once laughed at them. I stopped seeing friends because it felt easier than explaining why I always canceled. My fingers tightened around the warm mug. Eventually, I forgot who I was before all of that. The kitchen fell silent again except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Adrian looked toward the window for a brief moment before meeting my eyes again. There was no pity in his expression, only understanding. The strongest prisons, he said quietly, are usually invisible. Those words settled somewhere deep inside me because they described what I had never found the language to explain. I had walked away months ago, yet part of me still lived inside that invisible cage. Adrian reached toward a nearby drawer and removed a small leather notebook along with a fountain pen. He placed both on the counter beside my cup. Tomorrow morning, he said, write down every detail you remember. Every message, every place, every name, even the things that seem unimportant. I looked at him with uncertainty. Will that change anything? His steady gaze never wavered. The truth always begins as scattered pieces. We gather them first. Then we decide what comes next. For the first time and longer than I could remember, the future no longer felt like something I had to survive alone. The leather notebook rested in front of me long after the conversation should have ended. I traced the edge of its cover with my thumb, wondering how something so ordinary could feel so significant. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving the gardens wrapped in a silver glow beneath the estate lights. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt patient. Adrian moved toward the coffee machine, filling the room with the rich aroma of freshly ground beans. He prepared a cup for himself without asking whether I wanted anything else, somehow understanding that the chamomile tea still warming my hands was exactly what I needed. You should get some rest, he said. Tomorrow will be easier if you sleep. I smiled faintly. I have been telling myself that for months. He looked at me for a moment before speaking again. Then tonight, let someone else believe it for you. Those words settled into my heart more deeply than I expected. I had spent so long carrying every fear alone that I no longer knew what it felt like when someone quietly shared the weight. I opened the notebook to the first blank page. My hand hesitated above the paper before writing the first date I could remember. Then another. A location. A phone number I had memorized without meaning to. The name of a coffee shop where I once noticed the same gray sedan parked across the street twice in 1 week. Tiny details I had convinced myself were meaningless slowly filled the page. Adrian never interrupted. He remained across the kitchen reviewing documents of his own, giving me privacy without leaving me alone. Every few minutes I glanced up, almost expecting him to disappear, but he stayed exactly where he was. The steady rhythm of turning pages, the quiet ticking of the clock, and the warm lights above the island made the enormous estate feel less like the home of a powerful businessman and more like the first truly peaceful place I had entered in years. When I finally stopped writing, I realized several pages were already full. My breathing no longer caught in my chest. I forgot some of these memories existed, I admitted softly. Adrian closed the folder in front of him and walked over. He did not reach for the notebook. He respected that it still belonged to me. Memory hides when survival becomes the priority, he said. Once you begin feeling safe, it slowly comes back. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The pieces were returning, not to haunt me, but to tell a story I had never allowed myself to finish. Adrian glanced briefly toward the security monitor near the pantry before returning his attention to me. His expression remained composed, yet there was unmistakable resolve behind his eyes. Grace, he said quietly, from this moment forward, you will never have to wonder whether someone believes you. My throat tightened as emotion threatened to overwhelm me again. Before I could answer, he made one final promise, calm enough to sound like simple fact rather than dramatic reassurance. Whatever truth is waiting beyond these pages, he said, we will find it together, and you will not face it by yourself again. The first rays of morning sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor before I realized I had fallen asleep in the chair. The notebook was still open beside me, its pages filled with names, dates, places, and moments I had spent years trying to forget. My tea had gone cold sometime before dawn, but the knot in my chest had loosened. Adrian stood near the windows with a fresh cup of coffee in one hand, quietly watching the estate wake up beyond the glass. Gardeners moved across the lawn. Delivery trucks rolled through the front gate. The house carried on with its usual rhythm, untouched by the conversation that had changed everything for me the night before. When he noticed I was awake, he gave me the same calm nod he always did, as though nothing about this morning required dramatic words. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked. A faint smile crossed his face. "Enough." I believed he was protecting me from the truth. He had probably spent the entire night thinking through every detail I had written. Without another word, he picked up the notebook and carefully read each page. His expression barely changed, but I noticed the small pauses. A phone number, the description of the gray sedan, the coffee shop, the dates that appeared too often to be coincidence. He closed the notebook gently instead of snapping it shut. "Patterns," he said quietly. "People rarely realize they leave them behind." I looked at him with uncertainty. "Do you think I imagined any of it?" He answered immediately. "No." That single word carried more confidence than any reassurance I had received from anyone else. He walked toward the security office connected to the kitchen hallway and pressed a button beside the wall. Less than a minute later, a middle-aged man in a navy suit entered the room carrying a digital tablet. "Good morning, sir," he said respectfully. Adrian handed him the notebook without hesitation. "Compare every date with available security records, public parking cameras, and phone logs that can legally be reviewed. I want a timeline before the end of the day." The man nodded once. "Understood." He accepted the notebook carefully, treating it as though it contained something far more valuable than paper. As quietly as he had arrived, he left again. I stared after him in surprise. "You already have people working on it." Adrian looked toward me. "I told you we would gather the pieces first." He stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance. Fear grows stronger when it lives only inside your mind. Facts weaken it. I thought about that as sunlight filled the room. For months I had carried every memory alone, questioning whether my instincts could still be trusted. Now those memories had become something tangible, something that could be examined instead of feared. Adrian glanced toward the front entrance as another staff member quietly approached with an envelope. After reading its contents for only a few seconds, he looked back at me with calm determination. "Grace," he said softly, "it appears your story has already given us our first real lead." The envelope remained on the counter between us, unopened by anyone except Adrian. I searched his face for answers, but he had mastered the rare ability to reveal only what the moment required. He slid the single sheet of paper back inside before placing the envelope beside his coffee. "Do not worry," he said. "It is information, not an emergency." I released a breath I had not realized I was holding. Over the past few months, every unexpected message had trained my mind to expect the worst. Adrian seemed to recognize that habit before I spoke another word. "Come with me," he said quietly. I followed him through a hallway lined with family photographs instead of expensive paintings. That surprised me. The public knew him as a man surrounded by influence and wealth, yet the walls displayed old vacations, holiday dinners, faded birthday parties, and smiling grandparents holding children. They were imperfect photographs, the kind most families forgot existed until years later. I slowed in front of one picture showing a teenage Adrian standing beside an elderly woman in a small bakery. Flour covered both of their aprons, and neither appeared concerned about it. "Your grandmother?" I asked. He nodded. "She taught me that every person who walks through your door is carrying something you cannot see." He paused for a moment before adding, "She also believed nobody should leave hungry, frightened, or ashamed." Those words echoed in my mind as we entered a bright office overlooking the gardens. Shelves filled with books stretched from floor to ceiling, and morning sunlight warmed the hardwood floor. It felt less like the headquarters of a powerful businessman and more like the study of someone who valued quiet over attention. Adrian handed me the envelope. "Read it." Inside was a timeline prepared from the notes I had written only hours earlier. Dates had been matched with parking records, public surveillance reports, and documented phone activity. For the first time, my memories existed outside my own mind. They had become facts instead of fears. My hands trembled as I turned the final page. I was not imagining it. I whispered. Adrian shook his head gently. "No." I looked up at him, overwhelmed by relief more than sadness. For months I had questioned my own judgment. I had replayed every moment until I no longer trusted myself. Now someone had quietly handed that trust back to me. Adrian rested one hand on the back of a nearby chair. There is another reason I wanted you to see this. His voice remained calm. Truth gives people choices. Fear takes them away. I understood then that he had never been trying to rescue me by making decisions on my behalf. He was giving me the ability to choose again. As I closed the folder, the weight inside my chest felt noticeably lighter. I finally looked directly into his eyes without lowering mine. The man the city described as untouchable had spent an entire night helping a frightened woman believe herself again. In that moment, I realized something unexpected. The safest person I had ever met was also the one everyone else misunderstood the most. By late afternoon, the sunlight had turned the gardens outside the study into a wash of gold, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I found myself looking out the window without scanning every passing car. It was such a small change that most people would never notice it, but to me it felt extraordinary. Fear had trained my eyes to search for danger before beauty. That afternoon, beauty won. Adrian stood across the room, speaking quietly with two members of his security team. Their voices remained low, professional, and calm. There were no dramatic gestures, no raised voices, only careful discussion over documents spread across the conference table. When they finished, both men nodded and left the room. Adrian gathered the papers into a single folder before walking toward me. The timeline confirmed several details, he said. Public records matched the dates you remembered. There is also documentation showing repeated activity near places you visited. My stomach tightened, but only for a moment. This time the feeling was different. It was not panic. It was validation. I had spent months wondering whether my instincts had betrayed me. Instead, they had been quietly protecting me all along. What happens now? I asked. Adrian rested the folder on the desk without opening it again. Now everything moves through the proper channels. Verified information has value. Assumptions do not. I appreciated that answer more than I expected. He was not offering revenge. He was offering clarity. As the afternoon faded into evening, I wandered back toward the kitchen almost without thinking. The familiar scent of fresh bread drifted through the hallway, and one of the chefs smiled as she handed me a warm cookie straight from the oven. "Mr. Romano said you skipped lunch," she said with a gentle laugh. I blinked in surprise. "He noticed that?" She smiled knowingly. "He notices everyone." I carried the cookie to the breakfast nook overlooking the garden, realizing that the people working inside this house were not afraid of Adrian. They respected him because he paid attention to the things others overlooked. A gardener with an injured wrist received lighter duties. A housekeeper studying for night classes always found fresh coffee waiting before her shift. The driver who recently became a grandfather somehow finished work early every Friday. None of those gestures appeared in newspapers or business magazines. They existed quietly, where recognition was never expected. As evening settled over the estate, Adrian joined me with 2 cups of hot chocolate instead of coffee. "You looked like you needed something sweeter today," he said, placing one mug beside me. I smiled before I realized I was doing it. A real smile. One that reached my eyes. He noticed, of course. He always did. Neither of us spoke for several minutes as the garden lights flickered on one by one. Finally, I looked toward him and realized something that would have sounded impossible only days earlier. I was no longer waiting for my past to appear around every corner. For the first time, I was beginning to wonder what my future might actually look like. Several weeks passed before I realized the house no longer felt unfamiliar. The kitchen had quietly become part of my mornings. I learned which window caught the first sunrise, which cabinet held the cinnamon, and how the scent of fresh coffee always drifted through the hallway a few minutes before Adrian arrived. Life settled into a rhythm that asked nothing from me except honesty. The investigation continued without becoming the center of every conversation. Updates arrived only when there was something meaningful to share, and every new piece of verified information moved through the proper legal process. Little by little, the uncertainty that had followed me for so long began to lose its voice. One cool Saturday morning, I stood alone at the marble island preparing pancakes for everyone working in the house. The chef had insisted on teaching me an old family recipe, and although my first attempt had been far from perfect, nobody seemed to mind. Laughter filled the kitchen as staff members stopped by for breakfast before beginning their day. I noticed something unexpected. I was laughing too. Not because I was pretending everything was fine, but because, for the first time in years, it actually was. Adrian stepped into the kitchen wearing a simple sweater instead of his usual tailored jacket, making him look less like the powerful man the city imagined and more like the grandson from the old bakery photograph. He watched the busy room for a quiet moment before meeting my eyes. "This is exactly how my grandmother wanted a home to sound," he said. I smiled as I placed another pancake onto a plate. "She must have been a remarkable woman." He nodded gently. "She believed a person should always leave your table stronger than when they arrived." I looked around the room, realizing that without ever announcing it, he had built his entire life around that lesson. The estate had never been about walls or gates. It had always been about creating a place where people could breathe again. Later that afternoon, an official update arrived confirming that the documented evidence had resolved the remaining concerns surrounding my past. The uncertainty that had followed me from apartment to apartment was finally over. I thanked everyone who had helped, but when the room emptied, only Adrian and I remained by the kitchen window where this journey had truly begun. Sunlight poured across the marble counters instead of rain, and the reflection staring back at me looked nothing like the frightened woman I had once seen in the glass. Without thinking, I stepped closer and wrapped my arms around him in a quiet embrace. He hesitated for only a heartbeat before returning it with the same gentle respect he had shown me from the very first night. Neither of us spoke because words would only have made the moment smaller. When I finally stepped back, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. Home is not the place where nothing difficult ever happens. Home is the place where fear finally loses its power because someone chooses to stand beside you until you remember your own. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the one who can control the world, but the one who quietly helps another person believe in tomorrow again.